On December 26, 1991, his nation collapsed, and he was left stranded over 200 miles above Earth on the Mir space station.
High above Earth, a space station circled endlessly, while history collapsed below, leaving one man suspended between nations, calendars, and promises that quietly expired. What began as a routine mission stretched into 311 days of isolation, risk, and consequence. And to understand how this happened, the story must begin not with politics or technology, but with the man who realized he had been left behind. A man left behind. On August 26, 1991, Sergei Krikalev floated inside the Mir space station, performing routine maintenance when he received a transmission that did not resemble any normal update. The Soviet Union, the country that had launched him into orbit, was crumbling. The coup in Moscow had failed, but the fractures were irreversible. In the chaos, his return mission was postponed, and then postponed again. With each delay, the reality became harder to ignore. Krikalev was stranded in space. From his small window, Earth looked no different, but the borders, currencies, and institutions that had once defined it were dissolving. On the ground, leaders shifted, budgets vanished, and launch schedules collapsed to indecision. A cosmonaut trained by one nation now belonged to no nation at all. The people who had sent him up were no longer in power, and no one remaining had a plan to bring him home. For Krikalev, the Mir station became both sanctuary and prison, held in orbit by decades of ambition and a few tons of aging Soviet metal. His mission had been scheduled for 5 months. It would last over 10. And in that time, he would become something far more than a technician in orbit. He would become a symbol. A country imploding on the ground. The Soviet Union had once treated its space program as the crown jewel of technological might, parading its cosmonauts as emblems of ideological triumph. But by the summer of 1991, the empire was unraveling from within. Ethnic tensions surged across republics, the economy spiraled into hyperinflation, and a failed coup against Mikhail Gorbachev exposed just how fragile the communist grip had become. Within months, the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, once the largest nation on Earth, ceased to exist. As this transformation unfolded in real time, it left astronauts like Krikalev in an impossible position. His mission was overseen by Soviet infrastructure, funded by a Soviet budget, and designed under a Soviet chain of command. But by December, that command no longer existed. The rocket that would have brought Krikalev back was reassigned to a Kazakh cosmonaut, a political decision meant to appease the newly independent Kazakhstan, which controlled Baikonur Cosmodrome, the USSR's main launch facility. Russian officials, cash-strapped and disorganized, quietly asked Krikalev to extend his mission. Then they asked again. Eventually, they stopped pretending it was a request. Krikalev was informed that he would stay aboard Mir indefinitely, maintaining systems that were never designed to be operated alone for so long. Back on Earth, news outlets began referring to him as the last citizen of the USSR. While nations declared independence and flags were lowered, one man orbited overhead, drifting through the silence of space as a ghost of a vanished country, tasked with keeping its final space station alive. A living relic in a dying system. Inside Mir, Krikalev's world narrowed to the dimensions of a metal capsule orbiting 220 miles above Earth. Alone for long stretches, he monitored life support systems, recycled air, and performed repairs with the precision of a man who knew any failure could be fatal. The hum of fans, the click of switches, and the faint pulse of instruments were his only constants. On paper, he was a cosmonaut extending a mission. In reality, he was a man orbiting without a country. Mir had never been intended to operate indefinitely with a single crew member. Normally, responsibilities would be shared, and mental strain diluted by companionship. But now, Krikalev was its sole caretaker, tethered to Earth by scheduled radio calls and the hope that someone, somewhere, was planning his return. When asked about morale in later interviews, he would downplay the hardship. But messages preserved from the period reveal quiet signs of fatigue, uncertainty, and the creeping realization that time was no longer working in his favor. In a desperate move to sustain the mission and salvage international reputation, the Russian Space Agency turned to an unlikely source, Germany. For $24 million, the country bought a seat for its astronaut, Klaus Dietrich Flade, to board Mir. His arrival was not just a political gesture, but Krikalev's lifeline. After months in a kind of orbital limbo, a plan had finally formed to bring him home. By the time the replacement crew arrived, Krikalev had spent 10 months aboard Mir. He wasn't just an operator anymore. He had become a fixture, a living memory of a vanished nation, orbiting the Earth like a satellite of a history that no longer existed. And his most severe tests, as it turned out, were still unfolding inside his body. The body in orbit. Space changes the human body in ways we're only beginning to understand. For Krikalev, 10 months aboard Mir did more than stretch time. It rewired physiology, eroded muscle, and exposed him to invisible hazards with lasting effects. In microgravity, bones lose density, muscles waste away, and even fluids shift upward, pressing on the brain and distorting vision. But beyond these mechanical shifts was a far more insidious threat: radiation. Floating above Earth's protective atmosphere, Krikalev was exposed to constant cosmic rays and solar particles, the kind of radiation shielded by miles of air down below. By the end of his 311-day mission, researchers would estimate that he had absorbed roughly 82.6 millisieverts of radiation, equivalent to over 1,600 chest X-rays. Unlike acute exposure, these doses were spread thinly over time, but the cumulative effect raised his lifetime cancer risk significantly. In fact, astronauts who spend extended periods in orbit are often exposed to levels far exceeding what nuclear power workers are allowed on Earth. This data wasn't available in full at the time. Much of what we now know about long-duration spaceflight comes from missions like Krikalev's, where experience came first and insight arrived later. He became not only a symbol of endurance, but an unwitting subject in a live experiment on human limits. The physical toll was evident the moment he landed. Pale, gaunt, and unsteady, Krikalev had to be helped from the capsule by 4 men. He couldn't stand without assistance. His first meal back on Earth was a bowl of broth, served to him as he sat wrapped in a thermal blanket beneath the cold sky. He had survived space, but not without cost, and that cost was now written, cell by cell, into his body's biology, an invisible legacy of his time in orbit. Earthbound again, but changed. March 25, 1992. After 311 days in space, Sergei Krikalev touched down on a planet he barely recognized. The country that had launched him was gone, replaced by a patchwork of new republics and economic uncertainty. Hyperinflation gripped Russia. The ruble had collapsed. When he left, he was a decorated cosmonaut of the Soviet Union. When he returned, he was a displaced citizen of the Russian Federation, thinner, quieter, and holding an eerie kind of fame. Photographs from that day show a worn, pale man blinking in the sunlight as he's carried from the descent module. He had lost around 26 pounds, much of it in muscle. Standing unaided was impossible. Months of weightlessness had drained his strength. His face, once firm and composed, seemed older than his 33 years. The media lauded his heroism, but behind the headlines, the ordeal had redrawn his body and tested his resolve in ways no training could prepare for. Yet remarkably, Krikalev's relationship with space did not end in exhaustion. Just 2 years later, he flew again, this time aboard a NASA shuttle. He would go on to log more than 800 days in space over his career, and later became the first human to live aboard the International Space Station. Even as the world changed around him, Krikalev remained bound to the place that had nearly broken him. For him, space was not just a place of exile, it was home, and returning to it was not an escape, but a choice. The quiet legacy of a forgotten hero. Today, Sergei Krikalev's name rarely appears in headlines, but his story lives quietly inside the foundations of modern spaceflight. After returning to Earth and defying the odds, he resumed his role in the cosmos without pause. In 1994, he became the first Russian to fly aboard a NASA shuttle, a symbolic bridge between former Cold War adversaries. A few years later, he made history again as the first human to live on the International Space Station, helping inaugurate a new era of global cooperation beyond Earth. Though space agencies now better understand the physical and psychological toll of long-duration missions, much of that knowledge began with men like Krikalev, unintentional pioneers of endurance. His time aboard Mir helped shape protocols still used today, from radiation exposure guidelines to psychological support systems for astronauts in deep space. Now serving as deputy director at the Central Research Institute of Mechanical Engineering, Krikalev remains tethered to the cosmos, no longer by circumstance, but by choice. His ordeal is not just a footnote in Soviet collapse or a story of survival. It's a reminder that behind every technological milestone is a human being asked to bear its weight. They launched him as a symbol, left him circling like space debris from a broken empire, but he didn't burn up on re-entry. He rewrote the orbit. What would you have done in his place? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe, and we'll see you next mission.